Hi, my name is Shelby, and this is Merrily Morbid, the channel where we talk about all topics as long as they are, well, a little bit morbid. Today we're going to talk about 7 cases of mass murders that have never been solved. The cases will involve stories of hauntings, arson, drug deals gone wrong, axe murders, organized crime, and anarchists. So if you're ready for all that, let's get into it. This first case may have the fewest number of victims, but it is by far the creepiest of cases I'm covering in this video. It definitely gave me the heebie-jeebies. Some peculiar things were happening, or rather, not happening, at the Hinterkaifeck farm in early April of 1922. There were 6 people living at the farm, but not one of them had been to the post office to pick up the mail. None of them had gone to church on April 2nd. Then, the 7-year-old little girl who lived on the farm never showed up for school. Finally, on April 4th, their neighbor, Lorenz Schlittenbauer, and 2 other men, Jacob Siegel and Michael Pohl, all decided that someone needed to check in on the family, and it might as well be them. When they got to the house, they knocked, and when no one came to the door, they decided to go in themselves, except the door was locked tight. At this point, they decided to look around the property and head over towards the barn. There, they discovered the unthinkable. 4 bodies, each bludgeoned to death, stacked in the barn. The bodies had belonged to Kazelia, the 7-year-old little girl, her mother, Victoria, and her grandparents, Andreas and Kazelia, who she'd been named after. The men felt that they needed to go further, knowing that there were more people who lived there. They found that there was a passageway from the barn into the house, and that's where they discovered the last 2 people. Each were dead in their beds. Victoria's 2-year-old little boy, Joseph, and the maid, Maria Baumgartner, who had just started working for the family days before they were all found dead. From the beginning, it was going to be a difficult crime to solve. After the 3 men discovered the horrific murders, news spread fast, and soon dozens of people showed up at the farm. Talk about crime scene contamination. Regardless, the police did learn some things. They were able to deduce that the family had been murdered on March 31st, the same day that the new maid had begun working for the family. They believe that someone had been at the farm following the murders because smoke continued to come from the chimney, meaning that someone had been stoking the fire. And the family's farm animals had recently been fed. Who the hell would feel comfortable staying in a house for days where they murdered 6 people? Autopsies on the victims revealed that they had all been killed with a tool called a mattock. So what was the motive? No one knows. It certainly wasn't robbery, as money was found in the house, untouched. The family largely kept to themselves, so it was hard to think that it was some kind of bad blood. Okay, but what about suspects? A favorite suspect was Carl Gabriel, Victoria's husband. The problem with that was he died 7 years before the murders on the battlefields of World War I. Another suspect was Lorenz Schlittenbauer, the neighbor. Turns out he had had a relationship with Victoria. At some point, they were planning on getting married, and Joseph was publicly known as Lorenz's son, although this may or may not have been true. There was even a rumor that Andreas had been incestuous with Victoria, and that it had led one of the members of the family to kill everyone and then themselves. Except there is no way that any of the death blows on the victims were self-inflicted. Then, where it gets really creepy, is when the police questioned the former maid. She told the police that the house was haunted. There were noises in the attic, and when checked, nothing was ever there. Keys went missing from the house without any explanation. A newspaper showed up at the house, and no one could explain how it got there. One morning, before the murders, Andreas was outside his house and found unexplained footprints in the snow coming out of the woods leading up to his house. But there were no footprints heading back away from the house. The former maid decided that she couldn't stay there and quit several months before the murders. I don't blame her one bit. But that was it. Over the years, hundreds of suspects were questioned, and time again, each one was ruled out. It remains perhaps the creepiest unsolved murder in Germany's history. Of the cases that I'm talking about today, this is probably the one that has more connection to your daily life than any other. When you have a headache, what do you reach for? Tylenol, perhaps? You reach into your medicine cabinet and open the Tylenol bottle and see that it's brand new. The safety seal is still on it. You peel the label right off, not giving it a second thought, pop 2 in your mouth, wash it down with some water, and then go about your life. That safety seal that is on all medication bottles and on food containers isn't just to keep the contents fresh, but literally to save your life. Unfortunately, it never crossed minds that product tampering could be disastrous until 7 people died from Tylenol that had been tampered with. The first and the youngest of the victims hadn't been feeling well the morning of September 29, 1982. Mary Kellerman took an extra-strength Tylenol to help with her symptoms, to help her feel better. Within hours, she was dead. She was only 12 years old. That same day, a man named Adam Janus, who was only 27 years old and a father of 2, died suddenly of what was initially thought to be a heart attack. Spoiler alert, it wasn't. His brother and his wife were among the family who arrived at Adam's house to mourn together. Due to the circumstances and the stress, his 25-year-old brother Stanley and his wife, aged 19, both had pounding headaches. They looked around and found a bottle of Tylenol, having no idea of its connection to Adam's death, and they each took some. Later that day, Stanley also died, and his wife died 2 days later. The next day, on September 30th, Mary McFarland took some Tylenol while she was at work, and she died soon after. She was a single mom and left behind 2 young sons, only 3 and 5 years old. That same day, 27-year-old Mary Reiner, who had just given birth to her 4th child, took some Tylenol to help with the pain. The day after that, October 1st, Paula Jean Prince, who was a jet-setting flight attendant who had just returned from Vegas, died alone in her home, a bottle of Tylenol found beside her. In just 3 days, 7 people died after taking Tylenol. But what was it in the Tylenol that was killing people in just minutes to hours? And how did it get there? Very quickly, the sale of Tylenol was banned in Chicago, and within days, the owners of Tylenol, Johnson & Johnson, pulled all the Tylenol off the shelves, and testing began. Turned out that the Tylenol capsules contained cyanide. Investigations revealed that someone must have grabbed or bought the Tylenol, opened the capsules, poured out the medicine, refilled it with poison, put the capsules back together and back into the bottle, then went into the stores where the tampered bottles of Tylenol were left on store shelves to be purchased. Testing showed that the area with contaminated Tylenol was concentrated around Chicago. Although, the following year, a copycat would kill several in New York State. That person, James Lewis, was caught after trying to extort Johnson & Johnson for $1 million. Yeah, good luck with that. Anyway, back to Chicago. Rewards were put out for anyone who could provide information leading to an arrest in the case, but nothing ever panned out. Johnson & Johnson replaced the capsules with hard caplets and eventually regained the public's trust. In 1983, the U.S. federal government made it illegal to tamper with products. But the question remained, who did it? At one point, Ted Kaczynski, yes, the Unabomber, was looked at as a suspect, but he was ruled out. The copycat, James Lewis, was really the only suspect they had, but they were never able to place him in Chicago at the time, and they weren't able to match any of his fingerprints. So, that ruled him out. And with that, the case went cold, and remains so to this day. On June 14th, 1971, the house at 1970 Hazelwood Street in Detroit, Michigan, became a bloodbath when 8 people were shot. 7 people died immediately after being shot, and one, a man named Robert Gardner, attempted to escape, but was shot twice in the chest and was brought to the hospital after being found in a bedroom in the house. Investigations would reveal that the ages of the victims ranged from 18 to 28, and 4 of them had criminal records. Closer inspection would reveal that at least 3 different guns were used on the victims, since 3 different calibers of bullets were used and found. And strangely, the women, and only the women, were tied up. Neighbors who reported hearing gunshots also said that they saw 3 people jump out of the windows of the house. Neighbors also reported that people who had lived in the house had only been there about a month, and they saw young adults often coming and going from the house. People in the neighborhood had asked for the police to investigate, but no one ever did. That was until that fateful day. One of the first thoughts for a motive was robbery, but quickly the police realized that made no sense. Many of the victims had money on them, and Robert Gardner himself had around $600 on him. $600 is a lot of money for somebody to be carrying around in their pocket. It's a lot more when you realize $600 in 1971 with inflation is $4,586 as of February 2024. Do you know anyone who carries almost $5,000 around in their pocket? I don't. But you know who would carry that kind of money? Someone in the business of illegal drugs. Which brings us to what the police decided what the motive must have been. The police knew that it had to have been drug-related, not only from what the neighbors had reported to them, but while going through the house, the police found several handguns and several other guns, one of which was a sawed-off shotgun, which had been illegal for over 40 years. The police also found heroin packets, spoons, and needles at the home. The heroin, or dope, trade had become very big in Detroit by that time, and was behind a lot of the violence that the city saw. And they believed, without a doubt, that this massacre was a result of the drug trade. Soon after the shooting, the 3 people who escaped showed up at the local precinct to talk with police about what they had witnessed. The newspaper said that the Detroit police had reason to believe that it was 4 men that had been involved with the deaths. The paper released an article 2 days after the murders that revealed a little bit more of a suspected motive. It was believed that the murders of the 7 found dead in the house were just collateral damage, and the real target was Robert Gardner. The police believed that he had been selling fake heroin, and someone had a problem with it and wanted revenge. Due to the extent of Gardner's injuries, he was unconscious and wasn't able to give any insight to the police. Then, just days after that, another dealer, Gerald Williams, was shot 6 times in a hotel room. The police believed that Williams had been the one to tell the killers where to find Gardner, and with 7 people being dead, the killers were going to make sure that Williams wasn't going to talk. So with that, the death toll rose to 8. Then, June 20th, without ever having regained consciousness, Robert Gardner died in the hospital from his wounds. The Hazelwood Massacre officially had 8 victims. The final death toll, including Williams's death, was 9. The newspaper article that revealed his death also revealed even more of the story. The police believe that Gardner had previously sold bad drugs to a couple of dealers in Toronto, Canada, just over the border from Detroit. Gardner met up with the dealers to deal with the situation, which ended up with Gardner robbing the dealers. He took narcotics, money, and jewelry, which all added up to $20,000 in 1971, but over $150,000 today. But even with all that information, those people were never identified, and so the case was never solved. The Axe Murders of Villisca, Iowa, is probably the most famous unsolved mass murder in American history due to its brutality, its small-town location, and the number and ages of victims, not to mention the 2 little girls who just happened to be there at the wrong time. The Moore family consisted of parents Josiah and Sarah and their 4 children, Herman, Catherine, Boyd, and Paul. In June 1912, the night of the killings, two little girls, Lena and Ina Stillinger, who were 12 and 8 years old respectively, were spending the night. The family had spent the evening at their church and had gotten home late, around 10 p.m. Everything seemed normal. That was until the next morning when nothing seemed normal. No one answered the phone, and their neighbors didn't see them going out and about their normal routine. Concerned, the neighbors called some of their relatives, and when that did nothing, they decided to go over to the house. The doors and windows were all locked, and so they decided it was time to get local law enforcement involved. Soon, the town marshal was there and ended up breaking down a door. When he entered the house, their little town changed forever. As he walked through the house, he discovered body after body after body. The adults had been hacked to death, while the 6 children were bludgeoned to death. It was noted that the windows of the front door had been covered with pieces of clothing, but strangely, so were all the mirrors in the house. Perhaps the person who did this couldn't stand to look at themselves in the mirror, covered in innocent blood. The weapon had been an axe that had belonged to the family and had been left outside in the yard. So, the person hadn't come prepared. But aside from clothing used to cover the mirrors and windows and a bowl of bloody water in the kitchen, nothing else was disturbed. So it wasn't a robbery gone wrong. But who was the target? Who would want the Moore family dead? There was a single suspect, a reverend in the town, Lynn Kelly, who had left Villisca the morning after the murders. He worked as a traveling preacher and had recently taught at the daycare that some of the children attended. He had been known to have some mental issues. Supposedly, he told other passengers on the train that he was on that 8 people had been killed, even though by that time no one had known about the killings yet. He would end up confessing, saying that God had told him to do it, but later he took back the confession during his trial, even though there had been a bloody shirt in evidence that had once been brought to the cleaners. The first trial was deadlocked, with it leaning towards acquittal. He was tried again, and that time he was acquitted. And with that, no one was ever tried for the 8 murders again. The case has never been officially solved. It has been called the French Valentine's Day Massacre. If you aren't familiar with the American one, it was the murder of 7 members of the mostly Irish North Side gang by members of Al Capone's gang way back in 1929 in Chicago. Just as the United States has organized crime, so do all other countries, France included. Just like other countries, the organized crime is centered in major cities. This particular atrocity took place in a bar in Marseille, October 3rd, 1978. The name of the bar was Bar de Téléphone, or the Telephone Bar in English. Just after 8 that Tuesday evening, 3 masked men entered the establishment and shot dead everyone that they could, which was the bar owner and 9 patrons. Another of the patrons managed to escape, but would die a violent death anyway a few years later. And one other person, Nicole Leone, the bar owner's wife, who had just gone upstairs to the apartment, narrowly missed being killed herself. The 3 men immediately fled out onto the streets and into the darkness. From entrance to exit, it was only 4 minutes. So the investigation began. Immediately, it was very apparent that it was some kind of hit, but anything else was just speculation. There was no evidence, and witness reports varied wildly and didn't match up with what the investigators found at the scene. For example, some witnesses said that they heard hundreds of gunshots, yet the scene revealed that the shots were controlled and deliberate. The investigators decided to look at the victims for clues, but found little. 4 of the patrons had records, but all were minor offenses. The case went cold. Then, Pierre Michel, the judge who was pushing for the case to be solved, would end up being assassinated by members of the French-Sicilian connection just 3 years after the massacre. His story became the basis for the French movie The Connection, starring Jean Dujardin. The telephone bar is still there, but has since been renamed. It was only 20 degrees Fahrenheit in the early morning of November 26, 1978, in Greece, New York. The night before, the hotel had hosted a singles night, and many had stayed and got rooms there for the night. The hotel had also hosted 2 wedding parties and was hosting a bus tour from Canada. So the hotel was pretty busy. Under one of the stairways on the first floor was a storage closet, and it was there that the fire started. Paper goods and linens were stored there, so it was prime fire fodder. The door for the closet, although closed, was not a fire door, so it stood no chance. The fire grew and spread out from the closet and up the stairs. The fire door there should have stopped the spread, but someone had propped the door open. The fire continued to spread quickly and amazingly fast. Soon, the entire building was ablaze, including the ceilings and the roof. Luckily, 2 separate off-duty firemen each spotted the fire and called it in, and rushed over and into the building to help people evacuate. It's important to know that this fire occurred almost a decade before 911 became available in the area. So, there was a small delay in the fire department arriving at the scene. The Greece Fire Department reached out to the surrounding areas for help with the fire, and would result in over 100 firefighters coming to help, and the fight would go on for over 2 hours. Around 170 people were able to be evacuated, but remember, it was 2:30 in the morning at the end of November. These people were in their pajamas, and many didn't even have time to put on their shoes. Some people jumped out of 2nd and 3rd story windows, resulting in injuries. At the end of it all, 35 people were injured and 10 people died from smoke inhalation. Those who died ranged in age from 26 up to 81. The subsequent investigation revealed that the severity of the fire was in large part due to the construction of the building. There was only one firewall in the building, which didn't even extend all the way up to the roof, meaning that it was useless. The interior finishes on the walls were highly flammable, and of course, the fire doors being left open. The temperature reactive sprinklers in the building failed, and the pull levers weren't pulled, so no water inside of the building was used for putting out the fire. There was no emergency lighting in the building to help people evacuate, and as for the alarm system, it sounded more like a phone or an alarm clock, and there was only one in the middle of each wing on each floor. Even when employees heard the alarms, they rushed out of the building, failing to call the fire department, and the alarm wasn't connected to any sort of automated system that would have notified the fire department. But all this aside, this isn't just the story of negligence. Although initially thought to be an accidental fire, just days after it happened, an expert on fire investigations declared that it was an intentional act of arson. Those 10 people didn't just die, they were murdered. The investigation revealed evidence of the use of an accelerant called butanone, which is used in laboratories and industrial settings. Butanone made the fire very difficult to fight with water, and ideally it would have been fought against using chemicals like those kept at airports in case of jet fuel fires. The investigator believed that the person who started the fire must have been familiar with firefighting and probably was a firefighter themselves. 400 interviews were conducted in the days following the fire, and they narrowed the suspect list down to 5 people, 2 of whom were the first firefighters on the scene. And another of the suspects was a man who'd lived in 2 apartments previously, which had burned down. He'd moved into the hotel temporarily and had gotten into an argument with one of the employees of the hotel, and he was kicked out not long before the fire. Unfortunately, there was never enough evidence to bring anyone to justice, and so it remains officially unsolved to this day, although the lead suspect today is the firefighter from Greece that first called it in. In 1914, World War I, the war to end all wars, began. A movement soon began in the United States called the Preparedness Movement. It anticipated that the U.S. would at some point enter the war and should start preparing for it. The movement aimed to help build the U.S. military and get the American people on board. As part of the movement's activities, rallies and parades were held in many American cities, including San Francisco. San Francisco had experienced tragedy a decade before when the city crumbled during an earthquake that killed around 3,000 and left 400,000 homeless. The city had done so much to rebuild and revitalize. There was so much growth and hope, but it would all turn a bit sour on July 22, 1916, the day of the city's Preparedness Day Parade. It was supposed to be a great show of patriotism, and there were places along the parade route where spectators could buy things like flags and banners to show off their own patriotism. There were over 50,000 people lined up and down the streets. There were 52 bands in the parade and over 2,000 groups participating in it, which included groups like nurses, veterans groups, and Boy Scout troops. It was an enormous spectacle, but about 30 minutes after the start of the parade, the unthinkable happened. A bomb exploded. 10 people were killed or later died of their wounds, and another 40 were injured. It was immediately suspected that the bombing had ties to radical laborers. Early in the century, laborers had often worked long hours doing dangerous jobs for little pay. The city's unions and blue-collar workers had boycotted the parade since it had been organized by the city's Chamber of Commerce and another group that was anti-union. Another suspected group could have been the anarchists. Although we associate the term anarchy with chaos and lawlessness, it actually advocates for the organization of society on a voluntary and cooperative basis, which I think sounds more like a commune than the negative way we associate with the term today. But it's important to note that the anarchists sometimes took matters into their own hands, trying to turn the country towards forming an anarchical society. They saw the government as harming its citizens, so subsequently they viewed violent attacks on the government to be self-defense and warranted. William McKinley, the 25th president, was assassinated in 1901 by Leon Czolgosz, an anarchist. Anyway, back to the parade. The district attorney for the city, Charles Fickert, wanted the culprits brought to justice quickly. He also just so happened to be anti-labor. Fickert hired a Pinkerton, one of the private detectives of the Pinkerton National Detective Agency, who had previous experience with radical laborers in San Francisco. Fickert asked the detective to compile a list of all the radical laborers who were in the city at the time of the bombing. The list was comprised of 4 men and 1 woman. Now, you'd think if Fickert just wanted justice, he would have brought the people in for questioning, but no. All 5 were summarily arrested without probable cause and then held in solitary confinement. They were prohibited from communication with friends, family, and even legal counsel. Justice? Really? No investigation was done. The crime scene was immediately hosed down and any possible evidence destroyed. Yet all 5 were charged with murder. Then the trial was a real show, which would include doctored photographic evidence and perjury. 2 of the people, Thomas Mooney and Warren K. Billings, were convicted. Thomas Mooney was sentenced to death initially. A year later, it was converted to life in prison, but in 1939, the governor of California, recognizing that there was absolutely no evidence of their involvement with the bombing, pardoned Mooney and Billings. So, with their releases, the Preparedness Day bombing would become unsolved, and since no investigations had been done and over 20 years had passed, it remains unsolved to this day. And that's it for today. If you enjoyed today's video, hit the like button below and leave a comment. If you want to see more morbid topics from me, subscribe to my channel. A new video drops every Friday at 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And don't forget to see the community page to vote on next week's topic. Be merry, but stay morbid.